Good afternoon. Not quite as tall. If you can go to the next slide. I didn't answer the questions, but that's okay, I think, because they didn't quite hold for what I wanted to talk about. I am the coordinator of the African American Public Humanities Initiative at the University of Delaware. I did not start it, I inherited it, or I came into it. It had already been started. So I'm not the first coordinator or the person who thought of it. It's in some ways was put us together as a fellowship program, but also an interdisciplinary program. So it is a program for doctoral students in English, art history, and history, and who are focusing on African American public humanities. So it's also a fellowship program because it kind of gives them gobs of money in which to do this kind of work. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we do and how we try to do it. Go to the next slide. I talked a little bit about, at my table about how public humanities was a new term for me because it just seemed natural to everything I had always done as both a religion scholar and as a Black Studies scholar. The African American intellectual tradition is public scholarship. I just threw up a smattering of people, some friends, some historic people. If you don't recognize them, we'll talk about it. And because it's always been a sense of this is for the community. We're doing this work in the community, for the community, to teach the community, to give back to the community. That is the root of Black Studies as a discipline in the academy, and very much kind of what's long been happening in African American intellectual traditions. So it wasn't really hard to think about, well, if we're studying Black stuff or Africana stuff, of course we want to share it with the public. But to do this across the humanities was really what was new. As any of y'all know, in universities, getting 3 different departments to work together, and it's actually 4, because also Africana Studies, who are not housed anywhere near each other, is its own thing, right? And then to come together and do admissions around this program together was also a fun logistical part of what we're doing. So we wanted to ask, I think of it as asking 2 big questions. Here's the next one. And I think this was the first question that was asked when the program was started. And that is, what do Black graduate students need to be successful? Because we have to get them to be scholars if we want to get them to be public scholars. Now, not all of our students are first-generation students, but most of our students are either first-gen or definitely first-gen doctoral. And most of them also, some of them are non-traditional students, so they don't have a kind of family in which to sink down into when things go wrong. So the first thing that they thought about was, well, of course they need money. They need research funds. They need to be able to go to guild conferences. They need to have guild memberships. They need to be able, without stressing about this, right? Even if they're not presenting, they should be able to go to conferences, which, as you know, is probably hard for a grad student to get funding if you're not presenting. They need to have research funds so they can go to this library, go to those archives, and do that kind of work. So that was the first thing that was thought about and built into the grants. We've been supported by both NEH and the Luce Foundation. And what we discovered, actually, was that they need more than that. And we need to move funds around a little bit. Because first-year students don't really need to go to conferences. They need to figure out how to be first-year students. And so what they need were money for books. And they need money for technology. Because anything you buy at the beginning of your doctoral program probably doesn't work at the end of your doctoral program, just in terms of the way technology and software is built these days. And we also realized that they have funding for 5 years. They need 6 or 7. They actually need more time. So for example, of the cohort of students we've been working with, 3 students lost parents in the last 2 years. And they're sitting there thinking about, but I'm running out of money for my program. But of course their brains don't work, right? Because they're in deep, deep grief, right? So that's an example. I was like, if we just had 1 or 2 more years to give them, that would actually be what they need more than, say, $5,000 to go to a conference. Not that they don't take that, but in terms of what do they need the most. And so some of that was what we've learned of what do we think students need, and then, what do they actually need? And then, of course, I get to work with the policies that exist to see if I can get them those things. The second question we asked, next slide, is how do we prepare graduate students to become public scholars in, about, or on Africana scholarship? And so we did a lot of this during the pandemic. We did it before. But of course, the most powerful part is them having a cohort. So it's not just them. They come in, and they're not always in the same field. But we do have before, pre-pandemic, we had monthly meetings in person with meals. Post-pandemic, we have monthly Zooms, sometimes with a Grubhub card, if I can get it for them. So that they feel like they're not alone, right? They really do study together. They make friendships with each other if they didn't know each other before, and sometimes they're working on the same project. But there are a number of kind of skills that I wanted them to have and they thought would be important to have. Because they're going to get kind of the how to be a teacher skills, because we have that Center for Teaching and Learning. We wanted them to what do public scholars need? We've done a workshop on finding your voice. We've done workshops working with the op-ed project on how to write an op-ed. We've taught them how to build websites, and that someone actually builds it into one of their classes, and then we also work with WordPress as well. I got them we did a session on using academic Twitter responsibly, because you'd be amazed. We've talked about how to do a lot of open access for scholarship digitally. So some of them work with our faculty and do a lot of digital exhibits with the archives. They work on making archives and digitizing archives are some of the things that they do. And then our students have summer funding, which is also a harder thing to do, so they can kind of not worry as much, right, about how to pay their rent, so they can actually do internships and projects that they're passionate about. So some of our students are really kind of living the things that they're studying about. We have one student who does Black motherhood studies, and we were able to fund her to get training as a doula. We have students who are curating in museums. We have students who are doing digital exhibitions on 19th century Black thinkers. We have students who are working with the Colored Conventions Project and recently unveiled a mural in Philadelphia that they've done in the neighborhood, and others who are digitizing material on 19th century figures as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and we're glad to have this project.
Good morning, everyone. Or maybe it's afternoon officially. So I am here to talk to you just very briefly about our anti-racist pedagogy faculty learning community. I think I want to start with our next slide, which is just about how this aligns with our strategic plan in the School of Arts and Sciences. You know, we want to be a model for inclusive learning environments, and one where we really attend to issues of power, privilege, and social justice, and where we have healthy intergroup engagement around issues of power, privilege, and social justice. So we think a lot about, we have very diverse students at LaSalle. We are about half white, about half students of color. We're about 43% Pell Grant eligible. So what can happen in our learning environments really is unique, right? When all of these diverse students are learning with and from each other, there's a powerful kind of learning that can happen. So we want there to be diverse curriculum and diverse students who are really able to engage in conversations facilitated and in learning facilitated by our faculty. So this is goal 3. We have 4 goals in our strategic plan. This is goal 3. And one way we are trying to advance it, the next slide, is by real professional development, faculty development around these issues. So, you know, a workshop's not enough, right? I sometimes say I'm a weird dean. Like I spent 10 years in faculty development, how people learn, best teaching practices. And we know that a workshop, we hope, gets people interested enough to maybe do something more substantive. The way we've done this, we started really every year that I've been there, we will have a substantive diversity and inclusion kind of program, sometimes with external facilitators who, you know, will do a retreat where people really work together on issues. But this last year, last spring, our final faculty meeting of the year, where all of the faculty came together, was really a program about really looking at our own social identities and how those impact how we show up in the classroom and how we engage our students, and, you know, starting with the self, right? So that was like a one day. From there, we invited people to join us in the summer for a kind of a longer, like week-long program with some facilitators who got people to think more deeply about that and about their pedagogy, inclusive pedagogy. And then from there, we're like, well, we need to do something deeper than that, and that is where we have the anti-racist faculty learning community. And this is a year-long program engaging a group of faculty, and I think our next slide will tell us how many. I think it's 12. Oh, no. just letting you know, it's facilitated by Dr. Laura Roy. I want her to get credit. Like, she's really the one who's designed it for the year. Our group is meeting, I think, once a month. And she's the one who's creating it. And this gives you a little bit of sense of her background. And she's someone who we're thrilled she's facilitating for us, and she could facilitate for others if you were interested. We'll go to the next slide, which I think tells you, yeah, we have 12 faculty from across different disciplines who are participating. The course text is, Daryl Wing Sue's Race Talk, and really exploring how like these dialogues in an anti-racist framework can help us advance. The way that Laura has organized the working group is like, so once a month they're having these racial dialogues, kind of looking to transform the curriculum, but also create, community and connectedness in this group, right? Because we want our faculty to be able to work together toward these goals. Our next slide gives you a little bit of sense how she's organized this, where for each department, they kind of bring a dilemma. Like, what is something that they need to, and by the way, I had notes in my bag that I didn't have time to grab. Sorry, I'm kind of turning around here. But you can see like different kinds of problems that people brought to the group, right? Reviewing their syllabi through an anti-racist lens, or engaging in discussions about the readings, etc. So we wanted them to kind of bring like a real problem, and here's the last slide. These are the problems that they actually brought to the group. Is there one more slide? I was really not sure what was going on behind me, but I think this is the heart of it, that we really want our faculty to be able to work together on really looking at the curriculum, looking at grading practices, looking at how we facilitate dialogue, looking at how we, like what we reward in the classroom, what we expect in the classroom, and how we create classrooms that where students feel not only that their knowledge and their perspective and their experience matters and contributes to the learning, but also where they really feel a social sense of belonging in the environment. So back to, I guess the only thing I want to say is that we really believe in these longer term investments in DEI training, not the one-time thing that happens once a year, that it is something that's happening all of the time, from lower investment strategies to longer investment strategies to year-long strategies where people not only learn but create communities where they can continue to make change together.
Hello everyone, thank you for being here. Okay, so I apologize to the person who will have to hit next slide a lot, but I'm going to be sprinting through a few slides. So it's good to see you all. I'm talking today about a concept called disability justice. And so I'm going to explain a little bit about what the concept means, kind of where it came from, and then Sharon is going to talk about how it can be applied in terms of pedagogy. So next slide, please. So just to begin, disability justice is a movement-building framework that would center the lives, needs, and organizing strategies of disabled, queer, and trans, and/or Black and Brown people. And it was this term was coined by a group called the Disability Justice Collective, a group of disability activists from California. Next slide, please. And so one of the key ideas, especially for us as institutional actors in relation to disability justice, is to know that disability justice does not equal accessibility, especially in the way that it's defined by the institution, and it does not equal DEIA. And the way that I like to think about disability justice as something that that's part of my personal values, something that I want to bring to the institution, is to think of my work as a segment of disability justice, rather than saying I'm bringing disability justice to do this work. How can I shape the work to be disability justice? That's kind of another way of thinking about it. Next slide, please. So one disability studies scholar, Jay Dolmage, writes about how a medical and liability model of disability can force accommodation to happen, but it also tends to force always and only the legal minimum accommodation. Disabled people then come to have experiences of education shaped by these legal minimums. That's a difficult way to learn and a difficult way to live. So Dolmage is trying to bring to attention that the standards that we have within institutions often fall far short of what student needs are. Next slide, please. And so we have these dual concerns in considering ableism in the academy. And that first, that the academy has a history of ableism, and as Dolmage's scholarship shows, a lot of institutions, especially in the US and Canada, built their reputations through work that was exploiting disabled people that were institutionalized. And secondly, that higher education encourages people to hide disability, to hide differences, and to show intellectual strength instead of weakness, and that those are often alienating to students who can't meet those standards. And then finally, next slide, that the effects of ableism are not limited to students. And so we are implicated in the project of disability justice, not as people who are leaders, but as people who are experiencing ableism. And there are faculty and staff all over that are maybe quietly living lives with a disability identity, but afraid to say so because coming out in that way would hurt them in their job or in their career. And so when thinking about where just disability justice applies, it applies to everyone, including everyone here in this room. So, thanks.
All right, next slide, please. All right, as Drew mentioned, we thought we would share in the second half of our presentation some concrete steps and examples for implementing disability justice in the classroom, which really begins about thinking deeply about these three questions, right? Who do we imagine are our students? What does access mean or look like in the classroom? And finally, how can we learn from and with our students? And so to think along with these questions, I wanted to share this quote from Alison Quafer's book, from Feminist Queer Quip, which was really deeply influential in terms of shifting my own teaching pedagogy. So in this passage, Kafer presents her theory of crip time. She writes, crip time engages us in recognizing how experiences of how long things take are based on very particular minds and bodies. We can then understand the flexibility of crip time as being not only an accommodation to those who need more time, but also, and perhaps especially, a challenge to normative and normalizing expectations of pace and scheduling. Rather than bend disabled bodies and minds to meet the clock, crip time bends the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. And I share this quote because I think a lot of these ideas are so relevant since we have so many teachers in the audience with us today. And as teachers, we're always making these decisions about pace and scheduling, right? From the very moment we put together our syllabus to setting a course schedule of readings to setting these assignment deadlines, right? And this quote also brings us back to the question that I posed in our previous slide of who do we imagine as our students? Because we oftentimes create our syllabus with a particular student in mind, and that student tends to be an able-bodied and able-minded one. And so in this quote, Kafer is really pushing us, right, to think about how we can bend the normative clock, right, to better accommodate disabled students, and rather than forcing those students to meet those temporal pressures and demands of a normative clock. And of course, as teachers, right, we're beholden to our own kind of temporal constraints, right, of teaching course content within a 15-week semester, right? So there's no way to fully get around making those decisions about pace and scheduling and deadlines and so forth. And so the emphasis we want to really place on is to focus on what strategies we can implement in the classroom to push against that normative clock to ultimately create a more inclusive and accessible classroom. So next slide, please. So some of the concrete strategies that we wanted to share that we've implemented, but also other members of our disability studies faculty working group here at UMBC have also come up with are presented on this slide, and we don't have time to go over them in detail, and we're happy to talk more about them during the Q&A, but just to quickly run through, very explicitly, right, like ask students what they need and how you can support them within their learning in the classroom. Two, recognize that not all illnesses and disabilities are visible or documented, right? As you mentioned in his part of the presentation, right? Recognizing and trying to push beyond and strive beyond the notion of disability justice and how that horizon shouldn't be defined by like an accommodations letter from SDS or medical documentation, to recognize that those forms of institutional support are actually governed by a variety of different factors, including access, for example, to stable, good health care. Three, offering students flexible attendance policies and assignment deadlines in that spirit of CRIP time, offering alternative formats and options for learning assessment, really self-consciously building that time within the syllabus for rest and reflection, and finally being really transparent about the accommodations that you offer within your classroom, as well as the limits of your own capacity, right? And so I want to emphasize the last point, because oftentimes when we talk about disability justice in the academy, we do very much center students, but it's also important for students to recognize that teachers are also human and there's like limits to your own capacity as well. And so making that as transparent as possible. All right, thank you. That's all the time we have.
I have to look at the time. Good afternoon. It is afternoon. We want to share about the anti-racism and our actions faculty work group that we have been a part of, and I actually was a part of the beginning group of that. And the anti-racism and our action faculty work group consists of faculty and graduate students from Howard University, Bowie State University, American University, and UMBC. And if we forgot someone, please let me know. The group has been meeting regularly, about once or twice a month, since January of 2021. The initial meeting of over 40, or since the initial meeting, there were over 40 faculty and graduate students from around the region. There has been a core of about 10 to 12 that sort of remain active and consistently participate in every meeting. We've been meeting over Zoom, and even through the pandemic and now, and actually it was great because today I actually saw some folk for the first time outside of a box. So if you're a part of the group, raise your hand so people know there were some folks who were around. I know Perminda, and I'm not sure if anyone else is here. So we've been having a wonderful time gathering together. But we've had the time to think about how to demystify and destigmatize and magnify anti-racism and anti-racist practices throughout the academy. And so we've just been meeting, having conversations, but then also we've had book talks, as well as workshops. And so we had Dr. Sadat Haddadi and Dr. Guerrero in August of 2021. They led a workshop for us, Decolonizing Pedagogy and Praxis workshop. And then I'm excited that in February, actually 2 weeks from now, we will be having Dr. Bettina Love, who we want to do, we've been reading their book on We Want to Do More Than Survive. And so they'll be here to share with us, and it's virtual as well, but we'll be doing a book talk with them. And then we've also done book reviews where we've been reading books and talking through Bell Hooks, Teaching to Transgress, as well as Dr. Love's book as well. And so we're going to just take a moment to share about our own experiences in the group, and then we'll end it with how it ties to our individual work.
Thank you. So I'm perhaps maybe not the most reasonable person to be up here talking about the group because I'm so new to it. I started at UMBC just this past semester for this academic year. And so the work that the group has done and laid the foundation for me, I've kind of got to come in and enjoy the great thinking that they're already doing. But as a new faculty member at the institution, this faculty working group has been a way for me to find my people and like-minded colleagues. And I think when, as a theme of what we've been talking about today, like coming into a new space, I'm not coming in thinking that I have the answers, right? Like I'm trying to find the people who are already doing the work, figure out what they're already doing and how sort of my work can join with them. And so the faculty working group has really provided that space for me and given me an opportunity to sort of orient myself to UMBC and the incredible work that the group has already been doing.
And then for me, being an alum of UMBC and of the McNair program as well, so I was excited to be able to direct the program that I was once a part of. I've been sitting around the table, or proverbial table, I guess, Zoom boxes with my colleagues. And one of the things that hit me when we were talking about this was, it's like you hear that saying about preaching to the choir. So I'm a Baptist preacher by trade, that's where I grew up in. But there's this concept that, you're always talking to the same people, like you're preaching to the choir. But my thought is that the choir has to have rehearsal as well, right? And so what that group has been for us has been rehearsal. It's been an opportunity for us to hone our skills, opportunity for us to be challenged. And one of the things I wrote down in my own thought process of this is that it has allowed me to rethink policies within our program, because I'm from a minoritized group and I also support minoritized students, doesn't mean that I don't carry waves of white supremacy and those racist frameworks in our program and how we sort of maintain quote unquote business, right? And so it's really been challenging us to rethink that and some of the ways in that we do. And so again, the choir needs rehearsal. The other thing I will say too is that in this group, I found that I was excited when it was not just faculty, because it was great to have, and I'm a fanboy of Dr. Coleman, just so y'all know, and I follow her work, and so some of the things that she was sharing about the concerns of Black graduate students, I felt that and have been, dealing and feeling that in my own work and even with my alumni students. And so being in that space where there were also graduate students and faculty who understood that connection, and then also being staff, because sometimes staff are treated below grad students or below students and below faculty, right? We're sort of the last in the line. And so having that space where we can actually be, I had to even ask the question, could I be a part of it? Because I wasn't sure, because this was really a faculty work group. But that was no question. Like, they opened the arms and said, yes, definitely come in. And I've been there from the beginning. So that communal support as a faculty, as a grad student, and also as a staff member was important. And then I'll let her share on how it ties to your work.
So I'm a professor of elementary literacy, and so I'm working with our future and current teachers. And for me, literacy has always been tied up with power and access, and thinking about who gets to be literate, whose stories are centered and believed. And so I'm really, tying the work of this faculty working group to framing teaching as an anti-racist project about sustaining students' identities, and thinking about that both as culturally sustaining pedagogy and to tie to the group that just spoke, disability sustaining, viewing disability as a culture that is worthy of sustaining. And to do that, we really have to think about shifting the notions of accountability in K-12 education. We're often positioning accountability to administrators, to standards. We're having a national conversation about who we are accountable to in terms of curriculum that's allowed in classrooms. And so really shifting the notion to being accountable to our students and their families and communities. And particularly, Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about the education debt that's owed to students of color. And so if we think about being accountable to those students and their families, how does that change the way that we prepare teachers, right? And orient them to getting to know their communities, and really thinking about teacher prep as a space of archaeology of self and an ability to orient to the communities that they'll be teaching in.
And I've already connected to my work, but what I will say is, if you are interested, and we're going strong, so I don't see us stopping anytime soon. And so if you're interested in being a part of this, please reach out to either one of us while we're here, and even Perminda, who's here, and we'll make sure you get connected to the group as well. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. So I think I would start, I wanted to sort of talk about my research and kind of show how it's representative, in particular when we're talking about the academy. And so my research in particular looks at the ways in which to amplify Muslim women's voices. And it started off, post 9/11, where there was a sort of rhetoric. I mean, you all know it in terms of, Muslim women are all impressed. And so I went in to look at, and I particularly look at British, South Asian Muslim women, and I wanted to look at the ways in which they navigated both religious and secular space. And they particularly came out, and my findings of my research had suggested that no, there was a way for them to coexist being both Muslim and British at the same time. Fast forward many, many, many years now, and suddenly I started seeing a very different ways in which what I am thinking are their children now. And their children were posting art, poetry, music on social media. And in particular, we're talking about their dissatisfaction with the British state and really kind of talking about the failures of the state. And so the question became, why the failure? What was happening? And that's where sort of my work is positioned for this fellowship, which really looked at how young Gen Z Muslims are really using social media as a form of digital protest, and the ways in which they can sort of, and the ways in which they can express their dissatisfaction unapologetically, really, because what was previous felt that there was a bit more silence around it, and now they could really be open because they were really quite satisfied, or they were really quite rooted in their own citizenship and didn't feel that they needed to question their citizenship because they weren't immigrants. And which sort of leads me to the question that Jessica had asked us to really talk about in terms of diversity and equity. And I wanted to kind of really bring it to the academy in terms of the ways in which I think about my research in terms of the academy. And that really have two motivation. My motivation is really twofold. And the first is always trying to include voices that are silenced, right? And so, and which brings to the point where, which voices are we including? Because in particular, when it comes to Muslim women's voices or Muslim voices, we have a tendency to only include those that are, let's say, that uphold some of our value system. And so we end up really utilizing what we think is liberal Islam, right? And so what I kind of want to share, or what I want to make also the point is, should we not include those who don't share similar worldviews as us, right? And who might still have something to say about injustice. And so, for example, I include a text in about women who choose to join ISIS. Okay, and so I want to understand what are their motivations. What were the inequities in their lives that made them make the decision to leave their homes? And so when we talk about inclusion and equity, we need to think about who do we want to include in that conversation, and are we only including those whose ideas track with us, right? And so, for example, one of the questions that I'm really interested in is, can Islamist feminism exist, right? There's always been Islamic feminism, which is this idea that Islam is inherently ideologically, it sort of allows women the freedom that through theology, that is. But Islamist feminism perhaps says women should stay at home. And if women have the agency, are we going to say it's okay that they, that should be included as part of the voices? So I think in academy, one of the things we really do need to think about is how do we define equity and on whose terms? And the other kind of point that I'm really interested in is trying to understand that how can society be diverse but at the same time be socially cohesive? Because one of the problems is that does social cohesion depend on sameness, right? This idea of like, what is cohesion and how do we all come to agreement on ideas? And so the earlier research that I spoke of about Muslims in Britain really depended on the idea that successful integration and social cohesion really relied on expressing shared culture with Brits, right? However, now my research is suggesting that younger Muslims are saying, no, that earlier mindset really kind of failed in terms of equity and fairness. And so therefore, they're more underscoring their difference. And so I guess for me, one of the things I really want to kind of think about in academia is how to decenter like our perspective as faculty members in trying to think about how to look at, centering the student as part of that, as the conversation. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for those great talks, and I know that we're a little behind the official schedule and lunch is coming, but I do want to take a few minutes to see if there's some questions in the audience. Anybody want to raise a point or ask a question? Yes, please. And can someone, the younger is going to bring the mic over. Yeah. And again, say who you are and an identifier of some sort.
Liz Patton, UMBC, Media and Communication Studies. So I was really intrigued, Drew and Sharon, about building time for rest and relaxation in syllabus. Can you say a little bit more about what that means or how you do that?
Yeah, thanks so much, Liz, for that question. So I began my teaching career feeling that I needed to assign a reading for every single class session, right, to feel like I was teaching and that learning was happening. And it took me a long time to realize that that was false, that actually allowing students the time to rest and to reflect on the other course materials for the other class session actually was the most productive and generous space for them to actually learn the materials. So I'm a big fan of integrating unit review sessions where there's no new activity, no new materials and things assigned just over the course of the semester to allow students that time. And I have students lead those review sessions to bring back questions and things from previous assigned readings that they wanted to talk more about, because we inevitably, I know that a lot of people can probably relate. I'm very ambitious when I'm creating my syllabus, and I always want, there's so much content that I want to introduce to my students. And so I had to take a step back to really self-conscious, this is a class where I'm not going to assign any readings because I know we're going to also fall behind, right? Inevitably fall behind over the course of the semester. All right, so that's just my strategy.
Thank you.
Did you want to say something too? Yeah. Other questions? I see people sort of thinking, but yes, a question there and then here.
Thank you. My name is Monica Love, and I'm Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences at Bowie State. And I'm still formulating the question. I'm thinking about if we were in Florida right now, how all of this discussion would be impacted. And so it seems as if while we can talk about inclusion and public humanities, we're largely doing it from positions of safety. Nobody's gonna, right now, lose their jobs because of it, or departments be shut down because of it. But I think that's in the climate. So just wondering if others have been thinking about what it means to be conducting public humanities at a time when the United States is having a great deal of difficulty with difference.
Yeah, and I just want to say very quickly that I've been very mindful about it in choosing the words that we choose to put on, I purposefully put social equity in, some of the materials in order to sort of double down on it while we can. I just feel like people who can should. Yeah, go.
I'll add, a lot of this comes up with our students because not everyone lives on campus anymore. As soon as COVID hit, they're like, we're going home, right? So I have students in Texas, Georgia, Philadelphia, of course, but they're kind of all over now. They're not just in Delaware. And some students have the intention to go home. I would say the majority of our students do not intend to be faculty, right? They want to be curators, they want to be community teachers, and they're thinking, I'm going to go back to Virginia, I'm going to go back to wherever. And so they're thinking very consciously about, how do I do this? I even give assignments in some of my other classes of, how would you take this topic and teach it in a 6-week program in your local community, or some portion of this topic, right? And part of it's also thinking, what can you do in 6 weeks when you can't give grad level reading? Right? What can you teach? And some of them are thinking, well, where would I teach it? Because they have to create the context, or if they don't have an exact one in mind. And so how they put those things together actually depends on where they're going. So it's not that we're in as much danger in Delaware, per se, right? But my students are coming from all over, and they're thinking about their context, and I'm trying to help them think through, well, how might you do this? And because most of them are looking at African American context, they find the safer places to be their religious communities, right? So if I do this in a church basement, I do this in a masjid, right? If I do this in an Ile, this is where this is where people can come, and without monitoring. Right?
Patrick, I think you had a question. Yes. Younger's bringing it. It's coming.
So I was wondering how accommodations are accounted for at UMBC, because being a high school teacher, we have a city that provides for 504 accommodations for high school students, and I understand that those procedures, those structures are not necessarily in place at the college level. So say if I have a student who might be coming to UMBC next year, okay, and they've had, a number of accommodations. We teach all of our students to advocate for themselves so that they can get the resources that they need to succeed. My understanding is that that is not what, so students have to self-advocate more at the college level because those accommodations may or may not be available for them, and they have to advocate for those. Is that right?
Excuse me, sorry, awkward. Okay, thank you for that question. And yes, there is a total split, and it's kind of like K-12 versus college generally, where there's just kind of a wall between the practices in those two spaces. A lot of students who have accommodations in high school don't automatically get them in college. Sometimes the standards are different, and so they might have to receive another evaluation to get it documented so that they can legally have the accommodation. A process that can sometimes cost thousands of dollars, and so some students just don't even try. I don't know the number, but there are a lot of students on our campuses with disabilities that don't mention it, that aren't documented, because it's either they see it as a problem, they don't want to share that with their teacher, who may, and I've heard terrible stories of discrimination against students who have disabilities, and additionally that I'll just say that when I approach these kinds of things in my classes, like I'm teaching a class this semester called on disability and technology, and the first project is about access in higher education, and I allow students to write about their own accommodation process. And so part of what I see as disability justice in the classroom is allowing students to see the kind of ugly underbelly of these institutional practices in order to understand how they work, because you can't be effectively resistant if you're kind of acting within the rhythm of what's already happening. But I'm glad to talk more later.
And also, I'll just say this it strikes me as ironic because I know that a lot of the places that you may be talking about, they all probably have the boilerplate diversity statements that we don't, against, and disabilities is one of them. Yet there's I can see how there's a problem. Thank you for your engagement in that.
Yes, absolutely. There's lots of scholarship from smarter people than me about it out there. So if you look up, problems with ableism in higher education, you can find a lot of stuff that way, and also teaching materials for other people.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody for a productive conversation. You have a question?
It's a
Yes, go
statement.
for it. Yep.
Thank you for doing that at the high school level and at the college level, because then we can run it on campus with the staff. And I don't know what CRIP time means for staff.
Yeah.
And then also workers in the world of travel.
Good point. Yeah, I think this is an expansive issue that we haven't engaged with enough publicly in our institutions.